Hey everyone! Tonight we're stepping into one of the oldest and most persistent mysteries in the history of human civilization. Across every continent, in cultures that had no contact with each other, in languages that share no common root, in traditions separated by thousands of miles of ocean and thousands of years of time, there is a story. A great flood comes. The world is destroyed. A small group of survivors escapes, often on a boat, often with animals, often warned in advance by a god, or a dream or a sign in the sky. The waters recede. The world begins again. We're talking about the Great Flood. And the question of why every civilization on Earth remembers. It is one of the most fascinating questions in the history of the human mind. Before we begin, take a moment to subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here, and drop a comment telling me where in the world you're listening from and what time it is for you. Now dim the lights, get comfortable, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. The flood myth is the most widely distributed story in the history of human culture. Scholars have identified flood narratives in more than 200 distinct cultural traditions around the world. The ancient Mesopotamians have it. The ancient Greeks have it. The Hebrews have it in the story of Noah, that billions of people still know today. The Hindus have it in the story of Manu and the Great Fish. The ancient Chinese have it in the story of Gun, and Yu and the Great Flood that lasts 4 generations. The Maya have it in the Popolva. The indigenous peoples of Australia have it. The peoples of Polynesia have it. The indigenous nations of North America have it. Dozens of distinct versions from dozens of distinct peoples. The peoples of sub-Saharan Africa have it. The indigenous peoples of South America have it, including the Inca, whose flood story predates the Spanish arrival. This distribution is extraordinary, and it demands explanation. When you find one story in one culture, it is a story. When you find the same story in a dozen cultures, it is a pattern. When you find it in more than 200 cultures on every inhabited continent on Earth, you are looking at something that requires a serious answer to the question, why? There are essentially 3 categories of explanation, and all 3 have serious scholars arguing for them, and all 3 have problems. Tonight we are going to spend time with all of them, because the truth, if there is a single truth, may lie in a combination of all 3, or in something we have not yet thought of. The 3 explanations are, first, that there was a real catastrophic flood or series of floods in the deep human past, before recorded history, that the survivors carried in their memory across their migrations across the globe. Second, that flood story spread by cultural contact, that the Mesopotamian version is the original, or one of the earliest, and it spread along trade routes and conquest routes until it reached every corner of the world. Third, that flood stories arise independently in many cultures, because floods are a universal human experience, and the mind, confronted with the recurring reality of catastrophic inundation, constructs the same narrative framework to make sense of it. We will spend time with each of these explanations and discover that each contains real truth and real problems. Our companions tonight are not individuals from a single civilization, but 3 storytellers from 3 different traditions. Enkidu, a scribe in ancient Mesopotamia, who copies the flood tablet of the Epic of Gilgamesh onto clay, the early 2nd millennium BCE, and who understands something profound about why this story has been told for 1,000 years before his copying of it. There is Miriam, a Jewish woman in Babylon in the 6th century BCE, in the exile period, who hears the Babylonian flood story for the first time and recognizes in it something uncomfortably close to her own tradition, and who spends the rest of her life thinking about what that recognition means. And there is tamed, a Polynesian navigator in the first millennium CE, crossing the Pacific in a double-hulled canoe, who carries in his memory the flood story of his people and who looks at the ocean around him and understands in his body what his ancestors were trying to say. The oldest written flood story we have is not the biblical Noah. It predates the Hebrew Bible by more than 1,000 years, and it comes from the river valleys of ancient Mesopotamia, the land between the rivers, between the Tigris and the Euphrates, in what is now Iraq. The Sumerian king list, one of the oldest historical documents in the world, divides the history of kingship into two eras, before the flood and after the flood. The flood is not presented as a myth, it is presented as a historical event. The division between a legendary age of impossibly long-lived kings and the historical period. Before the flood, the kings of Sumer ruled for tens of thousands of years each. After the flood, the reign lengths dropped to something approaching historical reality. The flood is the hinge of history. The Epic of Gilgamesh is the great literary masterpiece of the ancient Near East and one of the oldest works of literature in human history. Its hero is Gilgamesh, the king of Uruk, who goes on a quest for immortality after the death of his friend Enkidu, and who eventually finds his way to Utnapishtim, the one man who was given immortality by the gods. And the story Utnapishtim tells Gilgamesh as the flood story, how the god Enlil decided to destroy humanity with a great flood, how the god Ea warned Utnapishtim in a dream, telling him to build a great boat and load it with the living things of the earth, how the flood came for 7 days and 7 nights, how the waters receded, how Utnapishtim sent out birds to find dry land, how the boat came to rest on a mountain, how the gods smelled the sacrifice Utnapishtim offered and gathered like flies around it. The parallels to the biblical Noah story are so striking that when the scholar George Smith first translated this tablet in 1872 and read its contents to the Society of Biblical Archaeology in London, a member of the audience fainted. The Atrahasis epic, which is even older than the Gilgamesh version, gives us the fuller context. The gods created humanity to do the hard work of maintaining the earth, the digging of irrigation canals, the building of temples, the agricultural labor that the gods found tedious. But humanity multiplied and became noisy, and the noise disturbed the sleep of Enlil, the chief of the gods. Enlil tried various methods to reduce the human population, plague, famine, drought, but each time the wise god Enki intervened and helped humanity survive. Finally, Enlil called an assembly of the gods and proposed a flood as the final solution. Enki was bound by the oath not to warn humanity directly, but he spoke to the wall of Atrahasis' house, knowing Atrahasis would hear through the wall, and told the wall to build a boat. The loophole in divine bureaucracy is as old as storytelling. The Mesopotamian flood stories are so consistent across multiple centuries of text. The Sumerian version, the Atrahasis version, the Gilgamesh version, that they clearly reflect a common tradition of great antiquity. The Tigris and Euphrates Valley is one of the most flood-prone regions on Earth. The flat alluvial plain floods regularly, and catastrophic floods that destroy everything within reach of the rivers would have been within living memory of any generation of Mesopotamians. The question is not whether floods happened in Mesopotamia, The question is whether the story of one particular catastrophic flood survived so many generations of retelling that it became the template for all subsequent flood thinking. Enkidu, the scribe, copies the flood tablet with the care and attention that his training demands. He has copied this tablet before. It is part of the standard curriculum of the Edinburgh, the scribal school, the text that every scribe must master. But tonight, copying by lamplight in the long silence of the tablet house, he finds himself not just transcribing, but reading, following the story as if for the first time. The 7 days and 7 nights of the flood, the silence afterward, the whole earth turned to clay, at Napishtim opening the hatch, and the light falling on his face, the dove sent out and returning, because there is no place to land, the swallow sent out and returning, the raven sent out and not returning, because the waters have receded. He knows how the story ends, but he finds, reading it again in the lamplight, that the knowing does not diminish the feeling. This is what stories do, he thinks. They make you feel the thing as if it is happening now, as if you are there, as if the flood is coming, and you are the one watching the sky. The story of Noah and the Ark is one of the most widely known narratives in human history. For billions of people, it is not merely a story, but a sacred text, a divinely revealed account of a historical event. For scholars, it is a fascinating document that raises profound questions about the transmission of ancient narratives and the relationship between different ancient Near Eastern traditions. The parallels between the Noah story in Genesis and the Mesopotamian flood stories are so detailed and so specific that the relationship between them is not seriously disputed. Both traditions share a common ancestor, either a common original story or a long period of mutual influence, and the question is which direction the influence ran and how far back the common origin goes. The parallels are worth examining in detail because they go far beyond the basic plot. In both the Mesopotamian and the biblical versions, a single righteous man is warned by a god to build a boat. In both, he takes his family and animals aboard. In both, the flood lasts a specific number of days. In both, the hero sends out birds to test whether the waters have receded. The dove in Genesis, the dove and swallow and raven in Gilgamesh, with the raven playing the same role in both. In both, the boat comes to rest on a mountain. In both, the hero offers a sacrifice after the waters recede, and the god or gods smell the sacrifice. In both, a divine promise is made that the flood will not happen again. These are not vague thematic similarities. They are specific narrative details that point to a common tradition. Miriam encounters the Babylonian flood story during the exile, the period when the Jewish community is living in Babylon, having been deported from Jerusalem by Nebuchadnezzar. In Babylon, they are surrounded by the most sophisticated literary culture in the ancient world, and the Gilgamesh epic is part of that culture. Miriam, who is educated in the Hebrew tradition, hears the Babylonian story being recited in the market and is stopped in her tracks by the familiarity of it. The boat, the animals, the birds, the mountain, the sacrifice, the promise. She knows this story. She has always known this story, but she has always known it as a Hebrew story, as her story, as the story her God told to her people. Now she's hearing it told by Babylonians about a different hero and a different God, and she does not know what to do with this. The scholarly debate about the relationship between the biblical and Mesopotamian flood traditions has been going on for 150 years since George Smith's discovery, and it has not been resolved. because the evidence genuinely supports multiple interpretations. One view is that the Hebrew flood story is derived from the Mesopotamian, that the Hebrews, during the exile or through earlier contact with Mesopotamian culture, adopted the flood narrative and made it their own. Another view is that both traditions draw from a much older common source, a story that predates both the Hebrew and the Sumerian literary traditions, and that was already ancient when it was first written down. A third view is that both traditions preserve independent memories of real events. The question that Miriam carries for the rest of her life is not whether the stories are related. She can see that they are, but what the relationship means for her faith. Does the existence of a Babylonian version of her story that her story is less true, or does it mean that the truth her story carries is so deep and so real that it has found its way into every tradition that has lived near the great rivers? She does not resolve this question. She does not think it can be resolved in a single lifetime, but she keeps turning it over in her mind for the rest of her years in Babylon and after her return to Jerusalem. The question becoming more interesting and more generative the longer she lives with it. The ancient Indian flood narrative appears in multiple texts across thousands of years of Indian literary and religious tradition. The earliest version appears in the Shatapatha Brahmana, one of the prose texts of the Vedic tradition that dates to approximately the 8th century BCE, though the story it preserves is certainly older. The story is this: Manu, the first man, is washing his hands in a vessel of water when a small fish appears in the water and asks him to protect it. Manu puts the fish in a jar, then in a larger vessel, then in a lake, then in the ocean as it grows too large for each container. The fish, now revealed as the god Vishnu in his fish avatar, the Matsya avatar, tells Manu that a great flood is coming that will destroy all life on earth, and instructs him to build a great ship and fill it with the seeds of all living things. The flood comes. Manu's ship is tossed on the water until the fish appears again and tows the ship by its horn to the mountains of the north, where the ship comes to rest as the waters recede. Manu then performs the sacrifices and austerities that allow him to create the new race of human beings who will repopulate the earth. The Chinese flood tradition is one of the most distinctive in the world because it is embedded in a specifically historical and political context. The Chinese flood story is not primarily about destruction and survival. It is about governance, about the long and difficult work of managing the flood that does not end, but must be lived with and controlled. The story centers on two figures, Gun and his son Yu. The mythological emperor, Yao, is confronted with a great flood that covers the earth, and he appoints Gun to deal with it. Gun's approach is to block and dam the waters. He works for 9 years without success, because the blocked water always finds another way through. Yao's successor Shun eventually executes Gun for his failure and appoints Gun's son Yu to continue the work. Yu takes a different approach. Instead of blocking the water, he channels it. He digs canals and drainage systems and guides the flood waters to the sea. He works for 13 years, passing his own house 3 times without stopping to enter. Such is his dedication to the task. He succeeds. The waters are tamed, and for his achievement, he is made emperor, the founder of the first Chinese dynasty. The Xia.Te navigates his double-hulled canoe across the open Pacific and the darkness before dawn, reading the stars and the swells and the phosphorescence of the water in the way that his tradition has taught him. He carries in his memory, alongside the navigational knowledge and the genealogies of his people, the flood story that his grandmother taught him and that her grandmother taught her, and that goes back into the deep past before any voyage he knows about. The Polynesian flood traditions vary significantly across the different island groups. The Hawaiian, version differs from the Maori version, which differs from the Samoan version, which differs from the Tahitian version, but common elements recur. A great rise of the sea, a survivor or survivors who escape on a boat or a raft or a mountain, the waters receding, the world beginning again. Tay-El thinks about the flood story his grandmother told him as he watches the horizon lighten with the first suggestion of dawn. The story in his tradition speaks of a time when the sky came down and the sea rose up and the world between them was destroyed, and only those who had prepared, who had lashed their canoe well and stored provisions and read the signs in the sky and the water, survived to find the land again when the waters receded. He realizes, living the story every time he navigates. The preparation, the reading of signs, the entrance of the open ocean, the finding of land. This is what his ancestors encoded in the flood myth, not a past event only, but a present practice. The flood story is the navigator's creed. The geological and archaeological evidence for catastrophic floods in the human past is substantial and growing. The most dramatic geological candidate is the end of the last ice age, between approximately 20,000 and 10,000 years ago. The great ice sheets that covered much of the northern hemisphere melted, raising global sea levels by more than 100 meters. Within that long process, there were episodes of catastrophically rapid sea level rise that would have inundated coastal settlements that had been stable for generations, turning coastlines into the sea floor within years or decades. The Black Sea flood hypothesis, proposed by oceanographers William Ryan and Walter Pittman in 1996, argued that at approximately 5,600 BCE, the Mediterranean Sea broke through a natural dam at the Bosphorus and flooded the Black Sea basin. At that time, a freshwater lake significantly lower than the Mediterranean, with salt water. The inundation would have been catastrophic and rapid. The farming communities around the Black Sea shore, forced to flee, would have dispersed across Europe and the Middle East, carrying the memory of the catastrophe with them. The problem with any single geological explanation for the global flood myth is the same. The distribution of the myth is too wide to be explained by any regional event, however catastrophic. Either there were multiple catastrophic flood events in different parts of the world that produce similar mythological responses, or the myths spread from a common cultural source, or they arise independently wherever people live near water that can flood. The second major category of explanation is cultural diffusion, the spread of stories along routes of trade, migration, conquest, and cultural contact. The case for cultural diffusion is strongest in the ancient Near East, where the relationship between the Mesopotamian and biblical flood traditions is clearly one of contact and transmission. But the stronger argument against pure cultural diffusion as the complete explanation is the independence of the traditions from each other in their details. If the global flood myth spread from a single Mesopotamian original, we would expect to find consistent details in the versions that appear in distant cultures. Instead, what we find is a consistent structure: warning, boat, survival, receding waters, new beginning, with enormously varied details. The Chinese version has no boat. The Polynesian versions have no rainbow promise. This variation pattern is more consistent with independent origin than with transmission from a single source. The third category of explanation asks what internal human reality the flood myth expresses, what it is about the human mind and the human situation that produces the flood story independently wherever human beings live in proximity to water that can overflow its banks and destroy everything. The flood story has a structure that recurs not just in literal flood myths, but in stories of all kinds across all cultures, the world as it was, the catastrophe that destroys it, the survival of a remnant, the rebuilding. This is the death and rebirth structure that scholars of comparative religion have identified as one of the fundamental patterns of human mythological thought. Te'eo, on his canoe in the middle of the Pacific, understands the flood story in the practical terms that his navigator's life has given him. Every person who has been at sea in a serious storm has experienced something close to what the flood myths describe. The world reduced to water, the sky and the sea merged into a single grey-green chaos. The familiar structures of the human world dissolved. The feeling of absolute vulnerability, of being at the mercy of forces vastly larger than yourself. The desperate clinging to the boat, the thing that keeps you alive. And then, if you survive, the return of the horizon, the appearance of the sun, the sighting of land. The flood story is not just a memory of a past event. It is a description of what it feels like to be human in a world that is larger and more powerful than you are. We have now spent an evening with the Great Flood Paradox, and it is time to ask whether we are any closer to resolving it. The honest answer is, partially. We have learned that no single explanation is adequate on its own. The geological events happened, but cannot explain the global distribution. The cultural diffusion happened, but cannot explain the independent variation in the details. The psychological universality is real, but cannot explain the specific structural consistencies. The most sophisticated, current thinking suggests that the answer is probably a combination of all three. That catastrophic flood events in the deep human past created the emotional and experiential foundation for the myth. That these experiences were encoded in story and carried with the migrations of early modern humans out of Africa and across the globe. That subsequent catastrophic local floods refreshed and intensified the tradition in specific regions. That cultural contact between neighboring traditions led to the borrowing and adaptation of specific details, and that the psychological universality of the death and rebirth structure ensures that the myth finds ready resonance in every culture that encounters it. What is perhaps most remarkable about the flood myth is not that it exists everywhere, but what it does everywhere it exists. The flood story is, in every tradition, a story about the relationship between humanity and the larger forces that govern the world, about what we owe each other, about what we owe the non-human world, about what it means to be the ones who survive when others do not. The flood story is also, in every tradition, a story about beginning again. After the destruction comes the first sunrise on a different world, the first step on newly emerged land, the first sacrifice of gratitude, the first seed planted in the newly enriched soil. Enkidu finishes copying the flood tablet as the lamp oil runs low. He reads back over what he has written and feels the satisfaction of the craftsman who has done his work well. He blows out his lamp and wraps himself in his cloak and listens to the Euphrates flowing in the dark outside the tablet's house. The river that can give everything and take everything. The river his city was built beside and cannot exist without. Miriam is in the market in Babylon on an ordinary morning when she hears a child asking her mother about the flood story, not the Hebrew version, but the Babylonian one. Miriam stands still and listens to the story she knows being told in a language that is not hers about a hero, who is not hers by a mother to a child, who is not hers. And she feels something she cannot name, a recognition so deep it precedes language, the sense of touching something very old and very true that belongs to no one people and therefore belongs to all people. She goes home and tells the story to her own children, both versions, and when they ask her which one is true, she says, both. Both are true. They are the same story, and the world is full of the same story. Tao watches the dawn come up over the Pacific, the sky lightening from black to deep blue to the pale gold of the early sun. He has been navigating for 3 days, and he is tired in the deep way of sustained concentration. But the tiredness is underlaid with something that is not quite peace, but is close to it. He has done what his tradition asks of him. He has read the ocean and the sky. He has kept the canoe on course. He has carried the story of his people across the water, as his ancestors carried it, as their ancestors carried it before them, as far back as there have been people to carry stories and water to carry them across. The water runs in the rivers tonight, as it always has, as it will after all of us are gone. The memory of the flood is older than any writing, older than any city, possibly older than any language. It is the memory of the moment when the human world was shown its own smallness, and the moment when something, courage, grace, preparation, divine favor, or simply the stubborn refusal to stop, allowed something to survive. We carry that memory still, in our stories, and our religions, and our dreams, and our deep fear of rising water. We carry it because we are the descendants of the survivors, all of us, everyone alive tonight, and the story of how they survived is the story we keep telling, in every language, on every shore, under every sky. This has been Midnight Chronicle. Sleep well, wherever in the world you are tonight.